Right then guys, it's PSL here, and I'm here for the 10th episode in my Power Stages series on DiRT 4. Last time we saw a trio of cars, all of which set stage times within the top 10 so far this series. And in fact the quickest 2000cc car, the 2007 Ford Focus, is the 4th quickest car overall. But if records are going to be smashed, then it's going to happen in this very episode. We've got all of the Group B cars left to come, but in this episode it's the real monsters, the 4-wheel drive Group B cars. Now, this has been by far and away the most difficult episode to script. It's nothing to do with the cars, although there being 5 of them doesn't really help. But they're all equally interesting as far as I'm concerned. In fact, they're all very different, and I realised that this is basically the Rallying World Cup. Representing Germany, you've got the yardstick, the car that revolutionised rallying, the Audi Quattro. Representing France, you've got the car that took Audi's idea and bettered it. The Peugeot 205 is lighter and slightly more powerful than the Quattro. For Italy, you've got arguably the greatest rally car of all time, the Lancia Delta. Okay, its power to weight ratio is worse than the Peugeot's, but it's both turbocharged and supercharged, so it's got ferocious acceleration at any RPM. Representing the United States of America is the Ford RS200. It's not the lightest, it's not the heaviest, it's not the most powerful car, nor is it the least powerful. It's pretty much slap bang in the middle in terms of everything. But this could really be a dark horse, and I nearly said that was partly because this car has the shortest wheelbase. Well, it doesn't, because representing the United Kingdom is this. It's an MG Metro. Now, I consider myself to be quite patriotic, but it's hard to get behind this. It's the smallest car here, which isn't really too much of an advantage in of itself, especially as it has, by far and away, the least power, and strangely, it isn't even the lightest car here. Also, apparently Austin Rover didn't have the budget or technical know-how to fit a turbocharger, which is why it's the only car here with under 450 horsepower, and it has exactly 100 entire horsepower less than the Peugeot 205. Now normally what I do in these videos is I go through the slower cars, explain their faults, issues and why they're slower, before I then live commentate the 2 quickest cars stages and show which one of the 2 is the quickest in the category. But it's not that simple. These cars are so wildly different to drive that simply saying their stage times doesn't really do each car justice. Yet despite how different they are to control, 4 of the 5 cars here set stage times within half a second of each other. Half a second! Anyway, the first car I'm going to talk about is the one that spearheaded this formula and is the blueprint that every other car here is based off. The Audi Quattro. It's the heaviest car in the category, but it has 476 horsepower to more than sufficiently drag this massive beast around. Now I always make notes about what these cars feel like to drive after I've completed the stage in them, and I wrote about this Audi, and I quote, "You never feel in control, wild over the bumps, but that's probably due to how quickly you go over them." However, it's all relative, because having now driven all of them, I can say that this car is actually one of the easier and more stable cars to drive in this category. As the pioneer of 4-wheel drive rally cars, it's no surprise that this car has got almost limitless grip and near limitless power as well, or certainly that's how it feels when you're driving it. Even despite that, you are constantly on edge. It's not a case of how quickly the car can go, because it can always theoretically go quicker, but it's a case of how quickly you can actually drive it. It's not the power or grip or even really stability that's the limiting factor here, it's the person behind the steering wheel. So in the end, it set a meteoric stage time of 2 minutes and 48.812 seconds. As it stands, that makes the Audi Quattro the 3rd quickest car in the game, and just behind 2 of the modern R5 machines. But of course that isn't the only 4-wheel drive Group B car here, and by no means is it the quickest car on paper. That's because there is the Peugeot 205, which is younger, more powerful, lighter and smaller. And I'm sorry, but this car is just too quick, at the very least around this stage. It's so quick it tricked my brain to a point where I was certain that this car was not subject to friction. I mean, there were a number of mistakes I made on failed attempts where the car just slid for so much longer than I expected, and so I ended up hitting something. But the reason it didn't seem like I was slowing down the car by sliding it was probably because I was entering each turn at such a high speed to begin with. I can say that this car is much more nimble than the Quattro, and if you approach a hairpin at completely the wrong angle, you can easily rotate the car around. The Quattro is much more reluctant to do that, but then again it is heavier and a bigger car, so that's not surprising. But in the end, the Peugeot 205 finished with a stage time of 2 minutes and 48.867 seconds. That's right, that's about half a tenth of a second slower than the Audi Quattro. Don't worry, because I will come back to this topic later, but this, the 1986 World Rally Drivers and Manufacturers Championship winning car, really did set a marginally slower stage time than the genesis of the formula. Next up is the Ford RS200, and honestly, the easiest way to describe it is it's a mix of the Peugeot and the Audi. It's got the lightness and nimbleness of the 205, but the stability and predictability of the Quattro. Despite that, in theory, perfect combination, it was slower than the pair of them, which isn't that much of a surprise if you know anything about the results of Group B rallying, or even if you just look at the crib sheets for the Ford RS200. It may feel brilliant to drive, but it just is slower, and really, factually, that's not that much of a surprise. But it wasn't that much slower, as it set a stage time of 2 minutes and 48.985 seconds. That's just less than 0.2 of a second slower than the Quattro, and 1.5 tenths slower than the Peugeot 205. The Ford RS200 is simply put an unhappy middle ground between the two. Finally, and the car that epitomises the main takeaway message from this video, the MG Metro. It's not a bad car to drive by any means, and in the grand scheme of things, it is a fairly decent rally car. But compared to the other four-wheel drive Group B cars, well, it is by far and away the least powerful, as it is the only one that is naturally aspirated. It's also not the lightest, as the Peugeot 205 and Lancia Delta are considerably lighter. So it's no surprise that this car is the slowest accelerating one here. Even despite all of that, the MG Metro set a stage time of 2 minutes and 48.499 seconds. That's quicker than the Audi Quattro, the Peugeot 205 and the Ford RS200. Yes, it's ridiculous, yes, it's illogical, and yes, there is no way that the MG Metro should be the quickest of these four. In real life, the MG Metro was one of the slowest cars in the category, and in fact, I didn't even know there was an MG Metro Group B car until this game was released. I know the gap between these cars is less than it should be, and that's because these cars are the quickest the rallying world ever spawned. So to drive these cars as quick as they can theoretically be driven, you have to have such a good feeling for each car, along with lightning quick reactions to correct or change or adapt for something should it go wrong. I'd like to think that I'm fairly decent at this game, but fundamentally the weak link in all of these machines was going to be me. There's only so quick I can drive these cars before I make a mistake, small or big. Unlike other cars where you can balance on the limit of grip and top end speed, you, or at the very least I, cannot even get close to a point where you run out of traction or top end speed in these cars, because the traction and top end speed is ridiculously high in these Group B cars. They're engineered to such a point where the weak link, unless you are superb, is the guy driving it. That doesn't explain why the Metro came out on top, but this does. So as I said, the MG Metro was the slowest accelerating car, and it got to the bridge in 8.916 seconds. But I've set up a second point to illustrate where this car succeeds and the others fail. Just listen to how this car carries on from the bridge.
Maybe 80, dip, crest. 100 through dip, crest. jump baby, dip, dip, crest. 100 through dip, crest, jump baby, dip.
That's right, I was flat out along the straight. That's a feat that none of the other Group B four-wheel drive cars quite achieved, and that explains where this car made up time. It's stable and controllable at high speed, so it got to the sign on the right-hand side in 26.148 seconds. The Quattro is much the same. It got to the bridge slightly quicker than the Metro, so in pure acceleration terms, it won. But it actually lost out on the way to the sign, as it wasn't quite flat out along it, although in reality both the Metro and Quattro got to the bridge and the sign in near enough the exact same time. So as you see, it's pointless having 96 more horsepower if you're unable to use it, if the car isn't stable enough, if you're not on the ground, if you don't have the confidence in it, if it's not controllable enough, there is no point having that extra power. The Peugeot, on paper the quickest car here, and it was the quickest of the four to get to the bridge, but just listen and you'll understand how its lead was decimated by the time it got to the sign.
Jump baby, 80, dip, crest. 100 through dip, crest, jump baby, dip, dip, crest. 100 through dip, crest, jump baby, dip, left 5. Right
I wasn't even close to being flat out, and that's why I got to the sign half a second after the Metro, and it's got 100 more horsepower. It's also very much the same case with the Ford RS200. Just take a look at the breakdown of the numbers here, and I'm sure you'll get the picture. Now I'm sure some of you will be thinking, well, why didn't you just go faster? Well, trust me, I tried and tried and tried, but kept on failing. I'm not sure what it is, but I think it's something to do with the suspension, because there were occasions where the Peugeot hit the bridge, and I think because the suspension was set up to be very stiff, it just can't absorb the bump, and so it gets translated into the car, lifting it up, and then it's game over. Also, I think weight has something to do with it. The Audi Quattro was very stable, and aside from potentially the suspension being more appropriately set up, I can't really see why else it was more controllable, because in the days before rally cars generated masses of downforce, it seems like the best way to get your car to stick to the ground is to physically weigh it down. It would explain why the heavy Quattro was so stable, but the Ford RS200 wasn't that much lighter and it had the same problems as the Peugeot. So I think the problem is partly suspension related and partly weight related, and quite possibly there's something else at play as well. I came to the same conclusion surrounding weight during my H2 video, where the Renault Alpine should have been quicker, it just should have been, but it was so light and sensitive to any bump that it meant it was a nightmare to drive, and slower than the statistically inferior Fiat 131. Anyway, make what you want of that, but what I can conclude is that from my experiences, the MG Metro is the quickest to drive over a loose gravel surface which has a lot of bumps, jumps and off-camber corners. The Ford RS200 is the easiest to drive and also the nicest one to drive. It feels less on edge and actually doesn't have all that many flaws. But unfortunately for it, it's not quite got the ferocious power that helps to propel the Peugeot or Quattro, but nor is it quite as stable as the Metro. But it's so nimble and chuckable that I would still recommend the Ford. The Audi Quattro is also very stable, and we saw I got close to going flat out on the opening straight. Its weight does mean that it can get stuck when it comes to some tighter corners, but if you have the space and confidence to kick the tail out, then that won't be an issue anymore. Finally, there's the Peugeot. It's frustrating because in theory, this should be the quickest car here, or at the very least, the second quickest. But in fact, it's actually the second slowest around the entire stage in the Group B four-wheel drive category. Its main problem is that it leaks time through a lack of control at high speed, but not from a lack of practice or experience, as this was actually the Group B car that I used during the career mode portion of this game. I can testify that this car is super quick, but on this particular stage, and crucially with me at the wheel, well, quite simply, I just do not have the skill to tame this car and get it around this stage quicker than I could the Quattro or Metro. One flaw I did notice about the Peugeot 205 is a brief drop in power coming out of the two hairpins. So it may be the quickest of those four cars in accelerating from a standing start, but if you let the revs drop and the turbo pressure go down, then the acceleration drops dramatically. That's not a problem that plagues the final car in this category, and the one which I've largely ignored until now, the Lancia Delta S4. It's the lightest car in the category, as it's the only one that weighs less than 2,000 pounds. It's got 450 horsepower and it's the only one that is both turbo and supercharged. It's the quickest car in the category, that much is clear, but the question is this 1986 Lancia quicker than a 2015 Hyundai? That's the current car to beat at the top of the leaderboard, and since the two cars in the next and final episode won't be at the top, this is the battle, the test to see if Group B cars really were where rallying peaked. The Hyundai has 195 less horsepower and weighs over 700 pounds more than the Delta. But there's also about 30 years of automotive development that separates them. The Peugeot 205, the Audi Quattro, the Ford RS200, and surprisingly but also especially, the MG Metro came close. But what about the Lancia Delta S4? Is it about to become the quickest car in Dirt 4?
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Thanks again, Nicky, and away we go. And this could be the one. This could be the car that breaks the top of the leaderboard and becomes the new quickest car in Dirt 4. Already we're past the bridge, and I should point out that this car is the quickest accelerating one in this category. And we'll have a look as it goes down the straight. Not massively quick, not flat out. I certainly could have gone over quicker, but I had so many failed attempts by that point, it wasn't worth taking the risk. Past the sign, into the hairpin. Very neatly done actually, not quite as expertly done as I did with the Quattro, but very well done nonetheless. Now, as I said, this car is the quickest accelerating one in this category. It got to the bridge half a second quicker than the MG Metro. It got to the sign at the end of the straight a tenth of a second slower than the Metro. So that means it lost 6/10 of a second relative to the Metro from the bridge to the sign. So this car, it is fairly stable. It's kind of on a par with the Quattro, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, this car, very quick, rapid acceleration. But even this car, which does have very good bump absorption, it just isn't up there with the Metro. But then again, the Metro doesn't have the power, which probably explains to some extent why it is so stable. And I've had some time to take out a couple of posts there. And I promise you, this is a good stage, and I took out a couple of wooden posts there. But no, this car, you can just notice that even when I was off the gravel there and onto the grass, it's just got very good bump absorption. Compared to the Peugeot, certainly, it's quite similar to the Quattro in terms of ease to drive, stability, controllability. It's similar to the Quattro, but the Quattro's got weight. Now this car is about the same weight as the Peugeot. It is the lightest car in this category, but the Peugeot, its suspension is rock solid. If you hit a bump badly, wrongly, at too great a speed, bang, that's it. And it will just react badly. This car doesn't. It's so much more set up for landing after jumps, and its bump absorption is so much more tolerant of actually going over bumps. The suspension is just set up better. Also the fact it's got 450 horsepower. Also the fact it's the lightest car here. Also the fact it's got a whopping great big turbocharger and a supercharger. Well, I mean, this car, I mean, look at it. This car, along this stage, I took out 2 wooden posts, and it's still been a magnificent stage. But can it beat the Hyundai coming around the final corner? Tight, yeah, definitely didn't lose time like I did in the Quattro. And the run up to the line, the turbocharger and the supercharger whirring up, and that's 2 minutes 45.174. And I lock up the brakes, and yeah, just went sliding off towards the spectators. But yeah, had to do a 3-point turn there, but there you go. 2 minutes 45.1. That has obliterated the Hyundai's time. The Lancia Delta S4 is the new quickest car in Dirt 4. And there you have it. Not the most dignified ending to a stage, but you have it nonetheless. The Lancia Delta S4 is the fastest car in Dirt 4, and by a good 2.4 seconds. It even beat the next quickest Group B car, which I still can't believe is the MG Metro, by 3.3 seconds. I could talk about how it is one of the more stable ones and how it has bags of grip and too much power, but also it's got the acceleration with the supercharger, which the others don't. But I'm not going to talk about that. I could analyse and talk about the Delta's strengths and weaknesses, but I think I'd be wasting my time. What I said earlier I still stand by, and that is that these four-wheel drive Group B cars are so powerful and so fast and have so much grip to them that the weak link isn't the cars themselves. If there is a weak link, it's possibly the setup of the suspension, but I reckon you could probably tweak that to make it certainly better. No, the real weak link is the driver. The Delta's plainly the quickest. Even in just accelerating to the bridge, it beats all of the other cars by at least 0.3 seconds. It's testimony to just how quick this car is, if it beats all of the others by such a big margin. Every other Group B car on paper and on gravel could never have competed with the Delta, which is why it's such a shame that the Peugeot is such a nightmare to drive compared to the Delta, because if the Peugeot and Delta were equal in terms of controllability, well, we would have had a good scrap between them, but as it stands, the Peugeot suspension is made out of God knows what, concrete I think, but there's no give to it, and any bump, it gets vibrated through the car and sends it off. The Delta suspension is a bit more sophisticated, there's a bit of give to it, and I think it is actually set up with the intention of going over bumps. Anyway, congratulations to Lancia for building this wonderful Delta S4, which even 30 years later still can't be beaten. But it shows just how far the rallying world has come on since then, because they can now build a rally car with much less power and much more weight, yet smartly and sensibly engineer it so that it is oh so close to the Delta. But it's so much more controlled and dependable than the Lancia, but then again, I think that's why we like Group B rally cars so much.